In Spanish, there's such a wide variety of different accents, different dialects, different words for different things that one of the most common questions I get asked by beginner Spanish learners is which Spanish should I learn, the Spanish from Spain or the Spanish from Latin America? Now, the differences are perhaps greater than the difference between British English and US American English, for example, but they're not that great. It's not that big a deal in the early stages. If you're learning the verb conjugations, there's only a couple of things you need to consider. For example, firstly, that the vosotros, vosotras form is only used in Spain or by Spanish speakers from Spain, which of course you'll find lots of them in other parts of the world, but they're the only people using vosotros. So only in Spain will you need to use vosotros or vosotras. However, if you go to Spain as someone that speaks Latin American Spanish and you use the ustedes form to refer to the you plural, everybody's going to understand you because they also learned those conjugations. They don't use them that much, but they understand them. It's not any different to like someone saying y'all. To me as a British English speaker, I understand y'all and I would never use it. If you go to the north of England, some people say use, a use going to the pub later. Someone from the south understands that, even though they don't use it. So it's exactly the same. There's no confusion. Similarly, if you go to the Americas and you use vosotros, lots of people will understand. Think of the amount of American movies that Brits watch or the amount of British movies that Americans watch. It's the same if you think about the music, the culture, the films. There's a lot of understanding of how different accents sound between these two parts of the world. Now, if you know that you want to go to Latin America, you're interested in traveling, working there, or maybe you live in the US, so it's the kind of nearer area for you to, you're more likely to meet people from there. You know, in the UK, we're more likely to meet people from Spain. Then what I would say is 1/3 of Latin Americans, roughly 1/3, use vos. Not vosotros, but vos. Now, vos is most widely used in Argentina. If you're specifically learning Argentinian Spanish, you need to have an understanding of vos. Other than that, it's used by some people like in Colombia, in Chile, in Central America, all throughout Latin America. You'll find some people using vos. So, for example, instead of asking tú, ¿cómo estás?, I just ask vos, ¿cómo estás? That's a bad example because it's exactly the same. If I'm saying tú tienes, it would be vos tenés. It's similar enough that you would understand. So my advice with verb conjugation, why not learn all of them? Yo, tú, the tú form, learn the vos form because it's not that difficult to pick that up and then you'll understand lots more speakers around the world. Learn then the él, ella, usted, nosotros, learn the vosotros one. You know, even people in Latin America in school, when they study Spanish, they have to study the vosotros form, so they have an awareness of it anyway. And ellos, ellas, ustedes. Being able to refer to, instead of referring to vosotros, if you need to use ustedes, it's the same conjugation as ellos, ellas. So if you've learned how to say the they form, which you need to learn, you know how to use the ustedes form anyway. So instead of saying vosotros qué hacéis or qué hacéis, and we'll talk about pronunciation in a minute, I'd say ustedes qué hacen. Yeah, not that difficult, or just qué hacen instead of qué hacéis. And in the vos form, it would be vos qué haces. It's not that difficult, not that different, so it's not that big a deal, to be honest, whether you are following teachers who are teaching Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, Colombian Spanish, Mexican Spanish, because 95% of it's going to be useful to you. Or you could argue that 100% of it's useful because the 5% that you're like, okay, the vos thing, I don't need to know that. Well, you might go on holiday to Madrid and you'll suddenly find that you're speaking to someone from Argentina. You never know. Now let's talk about pronunciation because that's one of the big things that I think when people are asking me, should I learn Latin American Spanish or Spanish Spanish? Do you teach Spanish Spanish or Latin American Spanish? I think they're worried about pronunciation. Well, to be honest, it doesn't really matter which accent you have because everyone understands everyone at the end of the day. Like if you speak a British accent, well, which British accent? There's so many. Spanish accent, which Spanish accent? There's so many. If you go down to the Canary Islands, they sound quite a lot like people from Venezuela, really, in some of the aspects of what makes up their accent. For example, they don't do the cerveza, they say cerveza, which is actually the reason that Latin American Spanish sounds the way it does because of migration from there to there back in the colonial era. The other thing to consider is that until you get really good at Spanish, you're probably not going to start sounding like a native. So if you're going to sound like a Brit or a French person, or you're going to sound like an American, then you're going to sound like an American whether you're trying to speak Argentinian Spanish, Colombian Spanish, or Spanish. And then once you've got to grips with the phonics of the language, you can start really choosing an accent or spending some serious time somewhere, and you'll find that you'll pick up the accent when you're at that level. Of course, just learning a new word, like learning that beer means cerveza or cerveza, I suppose you do need to make a decision. Am I going to say cerveza or am I going to say cerveza? So let's talk about that. In Spain, a lot of people think everyone in Spain speaks with the cerveza way. It's what's called ceceo or distinción. Some people actually might say cerveza or cerveza. There's lots of different variety. If you go down to Andalusia, some people would say cerveza. Most people would say cerveza. However, there's a city called Córdoba, which is in mainland Spain, where most people would say cerveza. As I mentioned, in the Canary Islands, most people would say cerveza. So it's not as clear a distinction as cerveza is Spanish, cerveza is Latin American Spanish. There's actually a lot of cerveza. There's a lot of beer in Spain. A lot of cerveza in España. Another really common thing with accents is dropping the S, saying España instead of España. And you find that a lot of Latin American accents have that same feature as Spanish accents. You'll find people dropping the S in Andalusia, in the Canary Islands, but also the costeño accent of Colombia on the Caribbean coast, on the Pacific coast. You'll find people drop the S there. Venezuela and a lot of Caribbean Spanish. There's a lot of similarities between those accents. Now going back to whether we say a S or a th, this is for when C is followed by an E or when C is followed by an I, like in the word cinco. It could be cinco or it could be cinco. Not a huge difference. If I say cinco in Latin America, they're going to understand. If I say cinco in Spain, they're definitely going to understand. Because like I said, a lot of Spanish speakers would actually say, from Spain, would say cinco if they're, for example, Canarian or they're from Cordoba. The other thing is the letter Z or Z for my American followers. Again, you know, difference between British English, American English, Z, Z. We all understand each other, the same as between Spain and Latin America. So this would also be pronounced, the people that pronounce CE and CI as the, and the would pronounce this as a th as well. One more thing I'll say about this is you don't actually have to choose. Just learn Spanish. You know, if you're watching a video on TikTok, don't scroll past just because you're like, oh, that's Mexican Spanish, no, that's Colombian Spanish, that's Spanish, I'm only interested in Argentinian Spanish. Watch it all because it's all useful. If they're teaching you grammar, they're teaching you about how adjectives match up with nouns. You know, 95% of what you're going to learn is just the Spanish language, and the grammar, the rules, the way it works, it's the same for everyone. The tenses aren't going to change. The only thing, you know, a couple of verb conjugations, like I said, vosotros and vos, a couple to be aware of. Believe it or not, many years ago, I sounded like I was born in Andalusia because I'd lived there, I spent a lot of time traveling there, and I've completely lost that accent. So even though I started learning Colombian Spanish, then I ended up, you know, deep diving into Spanish and actually sounding like a native speaker from here. And nowadays I can't even make that accent. I sound more like I'm from this part of the world because your accent can change. So you don't need to choose one. You can speak many different accents throughout your life. My English accent has changed throughout my life many times as well.